Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and whether you're watching live or archived. And welcome to episode number 94 of Nautel's Transmission Talk Tuesday webinar series. And I should say, welcome back. It's been a long while. I'm Jeff Welton, your host, just in case you've forgotten. And I've got a special guest tonight. So we're going to talk about something near and dear to the heart, that something that most of us started doing and don't do nearly as much of anymore. And so I figured it was a good time for a refresher. So my guest today is Burley Stapley, the chief engineer for Blanchard River Broadcasting. Now, Burley, I got your title wrong. I know I did. It's right here in front of me, corporate chief engineer.
That's
But
right. That's right. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
thanks again. Yeah, thanks for being here. And so this one is kind of fun because it's a recap of session that Burley and I did for the Midwest Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Conference in Columbus last fall. So, and,
We did.
and
We didn't have enough time, really. We kind of really skimmed through very quickly, and maybe we can slow it down a little bit, I guess, today.
So the cool thing about these webinars is we allow an hour, we record everything, and by the way, it is being recorded, so if anybody has to drop out at the top of the hour, know that you can catch the last bit on the webinar whenever, or on the recording when you've got a moment. We'll probably run a little long on this one because it is a topic that I expect there to be a little bit of discussion on, and I know I see a few people in here that I absolutely am aware can talk to this topic better than I can, for sure. And to his credit, Burley's done all the heavy lifting on this one. He built the slide deck, and I just add color commentary, which is pretty much normal for me. So let's just dive right in. Before I get going too far, we've got the mandatory housekeeping stuff. Now, Mark says he's not getting any audio. So before we go any further, is everybody else in the audience side, somebody want to chime in? Let me know if you can hear me. Marco, I see you there. I see John, a few other of my locals. Yeah, John Antonuck over. So John can hear me okay in Fairbanks. Well, I'm going to call that. You are in Fairbanks today, are you, John? All right, good deal. So the audio is getting through, so Mark is going to have to figure out what's going on there. All right, so moving forward, the mandatory housekeeping stuff, as I said, we do try to make these interactive, as folks have discovered with the question part. I absolutely have those up in front of me in real time. So I see Lauren in Newfoundland, Tim's here from Tennessee, yay. So yeah, put your questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, sarcasm. You can throw it all in there live. If it's funny enough, I'll throw it up. If it's part of the subject, then absolutely we'll bring it in. You've also got the ability to raise your hand. You can do that. I may notice it. I do have the attendee list here. If you just want to butt in with a comment, if you mention something in the questions and have a microphone and you're not shy, we can absolutely unmute you and make you part of the conversation. So like I said, this is something that I know a lot of folks, especially the ham radio folks, have a lot of experience with. So I expect it to be a fun discussion. And we're going to talk to two things. It's not just the soldering skills, which after 30 odd years in the industry, I've seen various degrees of that, from really good to what were you thinking. But we're going to talk about toolkits because everybody has their own idea of what should be in a toolkit. I think we'll have some fun with that too. Now, and you notice if anybody's looking at the cameras, Burley actually put his toolkit on the screen behind him. He's so proud of it. I tend to be a little more shy about mine. I just took a picture. Other thing worth mentioning, if you're an SBE member and you hold a certification status, then this webinar does qualify you for half of a recertification credit under Schedule I of the research schedule. So whether you keep track of that on an Excel spreadsheet or scribble it on a notepad or whatever, then absolutely make sure to log that. By the way, Burley presenting it qualifies you for a whole credit under a different schedule. So
All
SBE
right.
member, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'll put you on the line with that. By the way, if you're not an SBE member, folks in the audience, how come? Let's get her on. There's Chuck coming at us from his new digs in Phoenix. And Dustin says he's more interested in the radio in your background. So tell us the story about that, Burley, before we hit the topic.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, my son, when he was young, he's 20 years old now. When he was about 10 years old, he got an interest in old. He's always loved antiques, still does, of all types. But right now it's garden tractors and farm tractors. Now that he's a little bigger.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, that this has been 10 years ago or so, he took an interest to old tube radios, and I figured out that the tabletop ones were a little bit more expensive in the asking, and you could get the floor models a little bit cheaper. So I think I got this guy for about 30 bucks, and he works. I didn't have to do anything to it. I think I might have put a new plug on the end of it, an AC plug on the end of it, but didn't have to replace any tubes. I had two in here actually in my office, but when we remodeled our AM studio, I donated that one to just kind of match the decor in there. And actually, I think it's a little nicer. But yeah, this one actually works. Has a little bit of a hum on it, so it probably needs recapped. But a fun little radio. That's it. Really, nothing special.
There you go. Yeah. Dustin says he'd like to start collecting and restoring, but he hears the hobby's like a black hole. And I think it's like almost any other hobby. And you were talking farm tractors. So the first farm tractor I drove was a W6 Farmall with a crank start. I'm not sure if that says how old I am or just how long you keep a tractor going before you file it away and get a new one. So, all right, housekeeping done. Soldering has been around for a while, and I'm going to tap you on this. And you got a lot of this information from various places, but the folks at HACO actually gave you a fair bit too, didn't they?
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I've heard them pronounce it Hako. I used to pronounce it Hako forever. And my contact out there in, I think they're somewhere near Santa Clarita, California, out there in the wildfire area, they contacted me and offered me, or responded to my contact and offered me a lot of information back. So some of this deep dive information is from them. Some of the, as a matter of fact, a lot of the illustrations in the soldering portion of this presentation are from Hako. Yeah, they offered a lot of this, and we pared it down to what you're going to see today. But yeah, if you're interested in soldering equipment, of course, keep them in mind.
And so we are going to go through a lot of the history stuff fairly quickly, but yeah, so soldering, you're talking going back a couple thousand, well, 7,000 or 8,000 years, by the way I do math.
Yep, absolutely. Back to biblical times, Old Testament times.
And so I get into this a lot when I'm talking grounding, because people get talking about grounding and bonding almost like they're interchangeable terms, and they're absolutely not. And soldering versus welding versus braiding, or brazing rather, well, braiding too technically, but yeah, those are all very different things. Now, brazing is the one closest, isn't it? I mean, but you're typically using bronze with that?
Yeah. So yeah, brazing, and I always think of brazing as being kind of a high temperature soldering. But going back to what you always say, Jeff, and I remember you had mentioned this in your grounding seminar that you do every now and then, which is always great. It's always changing, by the way. I love that seminar, that session that you do. That the physical, in other words, the nut and bolt type bonding, it seems okay at first, but then over the years it starts to loosen up. It always loosens up. They always loosen up, and then especially if you bury them or they're outside with the extreme changes in temperature, those nut and bolt connections are going to loosen up. So always look at the exothermic and the brazing and the soldering type connections for your ground connections. Another example of that is, so the job I have now, I've been here 13 years. I replaced a guy, Dennis Rund, who some of you may know. He retired back in 2011, and he built this facility. And I still go through and I find connections. Now, these aren't grounded connections. These are audio connections under screw terminals that are just almost finger loose at times, just from sitting there for so long. And that's, in a somewhat controlled indoor environment. So they loosen up over time as well. So yeah, I've learned not only from what guys in the industry like Jeff have said, but just from my own experience, not to trust those mechanically, I guess you'd call them mechanically connected pieces. Yeah, definitely look at the exothermic and brazing technologies for that type of that type of connection.
Yeah, and I mean, anytime, I had an instructor in communications way back a zillion years ago that said, a mechanical bond is an okay bond, an electrical bond is an okay bond. The ideal one will be a mechanical bond with some sort of electrical connection on top of it. So, he was a big one for twisting the wires together and then soldering them. And, then what you do after that to insulate them, that's up to you, whether you use Marrettes or the little crimp-on nut types or whatever.
And not to get on a rabbit hole on that, but the guy that taught me, I guess one of the people that taught me how to solder many moons ago, when I was in tech school, he used to work for what he called NASA,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and he was a solder inspector, and he was picky. He was very picky. And he was one to always say that you had to make that mechanical connection first. And I think that's kind of the textbook way of connecting things, or actually that's the textbook way of soldering, is to make that hook around maybe a turret before you solder it on. But I'll be honest with you, unless it's a grounded connection, if it's say an XLR, obviously you can't make that mechanical connection with that. But two wires together, I will just kind of tin them both, put them together, heat them up, and there they are. I don't twist them together.
Yeah.
That's me.
Yep, and I mean, again, it depends on what you're doing and where it is. If you've got something, say, and I'll give an example. If I was joining two not identical metals, like not both copper wires, where one might be subject to a little different thermal expansion, I'd want a mechanical as well as a solder connection. William makes a good point in the question section about cold flowing, which we've all seen happen. You also see sometimes the connection, if you get any air in it, it can oxidize from the inside out. So yeah, they're definitely, depending on what you're doing, it makes a difference. I like to, like, when I'm joining two wires together, as a rule, I will tend to bend them over and twist them, just because that way I'm not requiring a third set of hands to hold them. But because as I get old and shaky, that becomes more critical. So a whole bunch of different ways of soldering stuff. For the most part, the one we do is just pure conduction soldering.
Right. Yep, absolutely. I think I don't think I've ever seen an example of laser soldering. These, once again, this list came from Heiko, who know everything about soldering. But yeah, the ones that I have personal contact with are the conduction soldering iron. Of course, we did a little bit of the wave soldering, just a rough example of it when I was in college way back in the day. But yeah, hot air, of course, too. You can get a hot air station. We can talk about that later. But you can get a hot air station on eBay pretty cheap these days.
Yep. Hey, I've been in sales long enough to know hot air is not in short supply. But
I've
all
got
right.
salespeople right across on the other side of this wall, so I know what you mean.
Difference is you have to be tactful. I'm talking about myself. So there are four primary things to pay attention to when you get into this. And number two, I kind of looked at it and go, solderability. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to solder stainless steel, as an example. You know.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, the 4 points at the keys, I guess. And I think we get into those a little bit deeper. The actual solder, the solderability, yes, like Jeff said, stainless steel. Dirty metal, it's not very solderable. Is that a word? I'm not sure. And of course, the flux and the heat. So.
Yeah. And by the way, as it said in the preamble, before I get too far on this, I got to do the mandatory shout out to Mr. Disembodied Voice, Ed Sylvester. I know he's been chomping at the bit to get these going again, and I kind of been dragging tail as I learned the new sales territory and spent last year running all over the country. So Ed, thanks for putting up with me.
My absolute pleasure.
So William mentioned in the comments that jewelers sometimes use laser soldering, and Lauren provided a link to the NASA standard for soldering through a magazine article. So maybe Ed, if you could post that up in the info where everybody, or in the chat where everybody can see it, that would be awesome. Let's see, and then flux heat. Okay, let's carry on. So talking about the solder itself, I mean, tin and lead historically, until you get into the Rojas days, are pretty much the gold standards, or the tin standards.
Pun intended or not intended?
Yeah, whether I meant to or not, exactly. And the only thing that varies, it's pretty much all, and 60-40, 63-37, I mean, that it's a pretty close ratio regardless.
Yeah, we used to call the 6337 solder cheater solder. And I think it was because it tends to flow a little, it looks prettier. It might flow a little bit easier. I might have got that from my NASA instructor. I don't know. I've kind of had that in the back of my mind forever, but I don't really see a whole bunch of difference myself. I think that the 6337 does tend to look a little bit better, but as far as usability, give or take
Yeah.
it.
And then you've got the high temp solder, which is what we used back in the day in a lot of the RF output filters where things tended to get a little more toasty. That tends to be 90% tin. And then beyond that, silver solder, where if I recall correctly, that's is that silver tin or silver lead? And that I don't know. It may mention it later on.
Yeah, I think it does. Not sure. There's a lot of those, a lot of those brazing rods out there and such that call themselves silver solder that I don't think necessarily would meet the classical definition of silver solder. Maybe they're better. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And Mark's got a note here about comparing standard 60-40 lead with non-leaded with the Rojas, and we will be tapping on that in a couple of pages too, I know. As yeah, there's very much a different technique, I guess. And not really, the technique doesn't change, but the temperature and the time very much do. And look at that, it wasn't even a couple of slides, it was the next slide. It's almost like I knew it was coming, but didn't know where. And yeah, so on this one, we've got 96.5, 3, and 0.5. I see copper, SN is 10. What's AG? Oh,
Oh,
tin silver. Silver is 96.5 and then 3% tin.
yeah, there you go. Okay.
It's been
Yep.
way too long since I had to look at a periodic table, or not long enough, depending on how you pay or remember that stuff. But the big thing is that this does have a much higher melting point. That becomes a challenge in a couple of ways. And we found this out when and we do have a wave soldering station at Nautel. And when we went from leaded solder to the ROHS, what was the acronym for? I know you mentioned it and I forgot.
Which acronym?
ROHS.
Oh, put me on the spot. I was going to lean on you for all of the non-lead stuff. You're the one that's in the industry.
I'm going to be Googling this. This is why I'm in sales now. Let's see, acronym. See, folks, this is what I said. I don't need to know. Restriction of the use of certain hazardous, so restriction of hazardous substances is the ROHS directive. Oh, look, William's already got it in there. He was typing it in faster than I could get it into my phone. This is why I don't thumb type. Anyway, so the big deal, because it is not a leaded solder and lead has a very low melting point, it does require higher temperature. Where that becomes a challenge is if you're working on a circuit board, especially a multi-layer board with through holes and various substrates internal to the board, you have to be really careful not to burn things. So higher temperature, less time. And again, it's a challenge. It's a learning experience for sure. I mean, the actual technique, heat the joint, heat the work, not the solder, and then flow it through and paint it. And we'll show that in a little bit. That doesn't change, but you're not doing high temp solder on a hefty joint like a MOSFET tab with a standard 25 or 20 watt soldering iron, like you would to do an 8-pin IC, for example.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, Jeff, it seems like I got an example here. Back in the old days, you'd have like a soldering iron, like this. In other words, not a soldering station that
Right.
has a regulated temperature. That regulated temperature comes in pretty handy when you're reworking modern electronics. That way, it stays that tip stays at the temperature you mean to. This type of soldering iron, for those that may be kind of new, it's not regulated. If I go to solder, say, a PL259 connector or something with this, it's never going to happen. Number one, it's not enough heat, but
Hmm.
that large connector would act as a heat sink, and it may not seem like it, but in the circuit board area, trying to heat up even a small silver solder type joint, it could be an issue if you can't hold that temperature steady.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing to remember, we're not talking a massive difference. I mean, just as a general guideline, nominal melting point of lead-based solder, and yes, I cheated and looked it up. Nominal melting point of lead-based solder is 361 Fahrenheit, or 183 Celsius for those of us that speak metric. And the lead-free solders tend to melt at, and it'll vary again depending on the blend, but based on the common ones, about 422 Fahrenheit or 217 Celsius. So you are talking about 15% higher melting point. And as you say, I mean, just for good soldering in general, having a regulated temperature gets you a lot better than the little Weller handheld pencils where it's on and then it's off, and then
Yeah.
it's on, and then it's off. So you're in the ballpark, but not necessarily there. And I see Ed's got the link to the magazine article up, so good to go there.
Cool.
So yeah, that is, I think, the biggest thing is being aware it does take a higher temperature to properly melt and heat the wire. Now, so solderability, we talked about it before, and yeah, like you say, if you got a really cruddy piece, and my background is farm kid, so for me, it's primarily trying to sweat a piece of pipe after a copper pipe after one blew out when the pipes froze because the barn was 20 degrees below zero. So, that's the sort of thing, and typically in a dairy barn, all those exposed copper pipes are a nice green color. So there's a lot of cleaning and wire work required to get them to where you can solder them before you carry on. And to be honest, it's not a whole lot of difference when you're talking circuit boards. I mean, if you pick up an IC by the leads and you get grease from your hands on it, that can make impact the ability to solder it.
Yep, absolutely. I always use the example of some of the old we have a military surplus generator for one of our sites here, and I tell you what, back in the day, probably different now. I think they do a lot of like epoxy potting on electronics now, but back in the day, a lot of that was still exposed. Some of those solder joints, and you go back and look, some of those are green. Heck, I've seen transmitters, old tube transmitters that have green connections in them. So, yeah, you really like wire brush technique almost to get those cleaned up and ready to rework.
Right. And by the same token, if you've got something, and just use an example that I've encountered myself once or twice. So an electrical and AC connection into a crimp plug. Maybe you've got like a bolt down connection with a stranded wire coming into a power transformer. And if that works out and gets hot, the heat will tend to cause some pretty good carbonization and oxidation on the wire. So you may have to cut it back a little bit to get clean enough wire to solder to
Yep.
in an example like that.
Yep, absolutely. I see that in a lot of automotive. If you've ever worked on old cars or anything, you start clipping back the wire, hoping to find some clean tin strands in there, and sometimes you
Hmm.
just don't find it. You've got to replace the entire wire. But I don't think I've ran across that in broadcast, but definitely an old car restoration type things.
Doesn't even have to be that old. My real boss has got a 2017 Mini Cooper BMW made, and I just replaced a headlight harness not too long ago for that exact reason, because it had burned out the old harness, just a cruddy connector on the headlight side. And yeah, and I assume a lot of it had to do with just the vibration of driving, et cetera, and so on. But but
Yeah.
it was burnt all the way back. So I had to, work my way backward and swap out the whole harness. So
Sometimes if you get desperate, I know maybe not so much for for burn marks, probably not a good idea, but those old pieces of wire, if you have to get it going, strip it back where you see the oxidized strands and spread them out, fan them out, and take some steel wool and just kind of grab a hold of that wire, pull it off, and turn the wire a little bit, pull it off a little bit more, and you're just kind of raking that SOS pad or steel wool across those strands, and that'll clean it up. If they're twisted, untwist them, of course, a little bit first, but that'll get you by, maybe enough to get that solder flowing on there just a little bit, just to get through, get back on the air.
yeah. And the other thing I've done on occasion is basically take a paper towel and grab a scoop of flux paste out of a tin,
There you
and
go.
then spread that on and hit them with a heat gun for a little bit.
Yep.
And I think we talked about tinning in a little bit too, so I won't give away too much there. But here's the big thing: how do you know when you've done it right, and how do you know when you've done it wrong? And so this one is a perfect good side view of bad to good solder connections. And of course, they don't include the ones with have virtually no solder on them. But if you can see through the hole, that's usually a bad sign.
Yeah, that's and that was learning way back in the day. And it's, sometimes if I get in a hurry, I have that problem where not enough solder, too much. But with the wetting and the wetting process, what I like to describe it as, we've all at least seen wax on a car. You've seen a car that probably needs waxed, and you know what a car finish looks like that has a really nice wax finish on it. The wax finish, what happens to the water that's on there? It beads up, rolls off very easily. And then the old cars in the junkyard that really have all of their wax gone, that water hits that finish and it spreads just out, and it almost seems like it becomes a part of that finish for a while. As a matter of fact, I think there was an old infomercial where they used to go to the junkyard. Wasn't it called New Finish, where they would rub that stuff on the junkyard cars and do the A/B comparison? Kind of like that, but the opposite being, you don't want the beaded finish when soldering. You want
Right.
the laying flat, no wax type look for your good wetting action. And if you look at those illustrations there on the slide, the one on the right, of course, is the good wetting, where it's just kind of laying flat. You've got a nice fillet there on each side of that joint where it becomes a part of it. It's becoming a part of it. And you can tell on the far left side there, where it's non-wetting, it's beating up like water does on your hood when you have that nice brand new waxed finish on your car.
Right. And I mean, then in the middle, you've got sort of a blend between the two. It's not making that nice transition onto the conductor on the board. So,
Right.
again, and that's the kind, like what William had mentioned before, that's where you will tend to see we always called it cold flow, but I think it's just more oxidation on the air gap between the two connections.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes your wetting and cold solder joint can be related. Just depends.
Yeah.
It's like paint work almost, where a lot of it goes into the prep. If you need prep, if you're not working on new items, a lot of times there needs to be some sort of prep.
Yeah. Even if you're working on new items, you need to do some sort of prep usually, because there'll be either finish solvents that need to be cleared off, or depending on the exact material, there'll be some kind of dust or crap or corruption that needs to be removed. So yeah, always a good idea to have that habit of doing the same prep work all the time, and then even if you didn't need it, it was done. Good. So here's where we hit into the flux, and yeah, heat activated acid is a good way of putting it. But that's, like I say, on a wire that is oxidized, sometimes by just sort of spreading some flux onto it and hitting it with a heat gun, you can get a head start on getting some of the crud off.
Yep, absolutely.
Again,
And I think that reference, sorry, Jeff, I think that reference to acid, an acid-like substance, is something to keep in mind, because you definitely want to make sure you get that off after you solder the joint. You don't want to leave any old flux laying around on the joint, because I've never seen it myself. Maybe I don't think I have, but if you have enough on there, it can definitely cause some deterioration after a while.
right. And So, I mean, yeah, that's the kind of thing we need and I was just about to ask this exact question. So the two that we tend to run in for flex type are, I mean, with cored solder is acid core and rosin core. And what is the difference between the two? And I might be hitting you with a tight question on this one, but
I believe acid core, isn't that that's the older type? I may be wrong on that. Of course, the no clean, of course, is the newer version, more production. I always think of it as, but
mhm,
of course, rosin is the one that we use it's, for lack of a better way to put it, it's infused into the roll of solder. I
right.
don't think I have a roll of solder here behind me. I should have. But yeah, that's what I've always thought of the organic acid as the older type. I don't think I've seen that in a long time.
No, and Williams getting me here. So acid core is used for steel and other ferrous materials, and
Ah, there you go. Okay, okay.
so it's a much more aggressive flux, whereas the rosin core is what we would tend to use for our kind of soldering.
Wonder why,
So,
and here's a question for you. When would someone, just thinking out loud, when would you solder steel? I'm sure somewhere there's a point to it. I've seen places where, yeah, it would be nice to be able to solder stainless steel. Um, of course, there's certain brazing and welding techniques for that.
so no, and Rick has already hit that seamed roofs.
What is that again?
Rick Funk just mentioned that seamed roofs
Okay.
would use steel soldering. So there you go. Outside of electrical, but yeah. And let's see. So you got liquid, paste, and plastic, all good there. And that's just again the types of flux. I mean, for the most part, rosin core flux is what I do with everything. Yep, galvanized tin work used to be soldered, galvanized rain gutters, automotive fill for panels. Boy, everybody's coming at you with the different applications for acid core now.
Let
So
me ask this one since we've got the group. I even stumped, I think it was, I wish I had that little tub with me. It was a little jar about this big and it had a lid on it.
mhm.
I think it was from Weller, and it's solder paste. And it's got the flux, it's got the solder in it, and it looks just like it's a paste. You would open up the jar, mix it up. It was great for soldering ground strap. If you had some ground strap at a transmitter site, you'd lay it down, you could almost paint that stuff on there. You could make those joints look so sweet. And I was trying to get some more of it because I'm still down to about like that much, maybe an inch to a half inch left. Um, and I had contacted the manufacturer. I'm pretty sure it was Weller. And I had the guy on the phone, and I gave him the part number that was on there. And he called me back after he did some research, and he said you've got kind of a unicorn there. He says we haven't manufactured that in about 30 years. I don't know where I got it. I think I might have found it at somebody's transmitter site somewhere. But boy, that stuff was awesome. But I haven't seen anything like that in a long time. And it really it's a paste with the solder and the flux in it, and it's yeah, it works great. It's the only thing I can think of before that in my world where I would use it is ground strap, and it worked great for that.
So just because I'm that kind of person and I'm Googling, turns out that Canadian Tire sells, this one's called Nitroflux, but this is pretty much looks like a pure flux.
Okay.
Timu, I don't know about that. Rosin solder paste flux for soldering on Amazon. So looks like, oh, here's one, Chip Quick solder paste from DigiKey.
Hmm.
So DigiKey, yeah, I don't want to, oh, I gotta verify I'm human first. Let's see. Yeah, I'm just double checking there. Okay, we got the check mark, so we know we're human. Websites are getting harder and harder. So this is, I don't care about your cookies. This is a syringe, leaded, no clean solder paste. It's 6337 in a syringe.
Is that more for SMD work, surface mount?
Do not know, but let's see if there.
Yeah. Yep.
That's what
Yeah.
DigiKey shows.
I think I've got that exact kit, as a matter of fact. That's
There you
kind of a little, yeah, I mean, you could use that for, I
go.
suppose, for
Jerry
ground
says
strap.
McMaster Carr also has solder paste.
Who is that again? McMaster?
Master Car.
Okay.
So definitely, I'll send you a link for that after.
Yeah, I was
But
gonna say it was nice because it was a big old, well, a little vat of it, and you could plop it on there. I know the syringes are small, so more for IC work, but yeah, if you got that in a big enough quantity, I suppose you could use it for
yeah,
ground
and I
straps.
say Timu is hitting me with all kinds, but I tend to
Of
avoid
course.
things that there's e-source parts, replacement low temperature solder. Yeah, so Google actually found a couple of options.
Okay.
So but AIM solder has, and they've got a paste selection guide.
Okay. AIM solder. I'll check that out.
Yep. So clean, no solder paste. So yep, couple of options there. Chip quick flux is excellent. That's from Mark. So, all right. Well, there, I learned a lot more. And then we get the standard stuff that we're all used to. And like I say, we went ROHS compliant in Halifax or in our factories a while ago. But somebody who looks a lot like me may still have a couple of the 1 pound rolls of Kester solder kicking around. That, and actually, I think you may see one when we get to the toolbox discussion. Jim is asking, where do I find 94% AG solder? So
Hmm.
that's silver solder, right?
Yeah,
If
it
I'm
sounds like it.
mistaken. That's $1 billion question. I think I can get that pretty much, well, jewelry supply stores for
Yeah.
sure.
If you go to let's see, what's the place called? It used to be called Air Gas here in Northwest Ohio, where I am. I think now it's called, I can't remember. It's basically a welding shop. You can
Hmm.
go in there and find it, and they sell some. And you got to be careful because a lot of times they'll say, if it's just high temperature solder, they'll call it silver solder. But depending on what you're doing, maybe silver solder will traditional silver solder will be okay, but do your research before you go into those places because, like I said, they'll label just about anything that's got a little bit more hardness than your traditional
Right.
solder, silver solder.
Well, and
So
like there's a pile of 45% silver solder on Amazon, but
that's
so,
probably a Timu resell right there.
but yeah, I'm just looking to see if we've got any high silver content. Let's go high temperature. So yeah, there are a pile of options out there. There's silver solder wire, high temp, and it's probably all going to be 45% again. So yeah, that's a good question though. So jewelry, say jewelry store. Well, asking a jeweler where they get theirs would be the good one. But I know we took some silver jewelry in for repair, and I was able to scavenge a couple of feet from him. So yeah, there's different options. Amazon seems to it's become my go-to for a lot of stuff, which is really kind of frightening. But that's a different discussion.
Yeah, I
Um,
was gonna say the silver soldering that I do is more for AM groundwork, that kind of thing, ground straps,
yeah,
etc. But yeah, if you wanted to silver solder something small, I would think, yeah, jeweler would be great, a great resource to find that out. But
right.
yeah,
Now, if you're doing ground straps too, I mean, more and more I tend to lean toward the Silphos bars, which you can get at electrical supply outlets as well.
yeah,
Because and I mean the Silphos, the silver phosphate, I can't say it, but I know what it is. But that tends to be, yeah. And there, William mentions that the stuff for brazing AM ground systems is usually 10 to 15% silver. So yeah,
yeah,
it's typically not a really high silver content for most of the silver soldering stuff we do. And
yeah.
again, heat is critical. By the way, if you're trying to solder an IC onto a circuit board using that tool to the right of the screen, I reserve the right to post pictures on the internet and call you names. Uh, now, having said that, there are times when that 200-watt soldering gun is a very useful tool. And I mean, SCRs, if you're soldering an 8 to 10 gauge wire right onto the lead of an SCR, you need more heat than you're going to get with a 20-watt pencil iron or 50-watt.
Right.
I can tell you from experience that soldering the coax shield onto a big track on a circuit board requires 250-watt pencil irons and a Bic lighter.
The Bic lighter is just for the cool factor, though, right?
Yeah. So,
You know, I was going to
Tim
say that when we did this session in person in Columbus, Ohio, a few months ago, I had asked, the group, how many folks still regularly use a soldering gun? I don't really use a gun much anymore. It used to be, back in the Marty days, Marty transmitters, like, seems like you're always replacing coax connectors, so you had to have it then. But it seems like I'm either using a solder station / solder pencil, or I'm using a torch of some sort for brazing, silver solder or something like that. But yeah, boy, I even broke out I used to carry a gun, the solder gun in my car, in my car kit over here. I don't have one in here now. I don't really need it. I guess it depends what you're working on too. What are the possibilities inside your transmitter, at your transmitter site, whatever remote locations you're going to. Really depends. Then again, in my locations, 10-minute drive, I can have my soldering gun back at that location, maybe 15, 20 minutes at the most. So.
So Tim from Tennessee mentions soldering rectifiers into one Nautel 3.5 FM 3.5, and he was one of the guys I was referring to, because I walked in, saw him doing that, and started to growl a little, and it's like, well, I guess it's the right heat source for the job, and hey, it all worked. It still works now. John Antnook over in Fairbanks mentions that the gun is still good for like the center pin of RG8.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and Mark mentions the Big Bertha soldering iron. You remember those wooden handled 200 and 300-watt irons? I mean, we still use stuff like that for soldering coils, like the 1/4 and 1/2 inch copper tubed filter coils on AMs.
Right.
So it's a handy tool. So very much the heat source will vary depending on what you're doing, and don't bring too much for the job. But like my 250-watt irons and a Bic lighter analogy, don't bring too little for the job either.
Yeah.
So
I want to say that the HACO rule of thumb there from their slide was the 260 centigrade and 500 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 seconds. Your mileage is going to vary on that. Like Jeff was saying, don't use more than what you need, but use enough. And it used to be when I was much younger, starting out, and I just had a regular old soldering pencil, like the one I showed you earlier. You didn't have any choice. Whatever that sucker was warmed up at, that's the temperature it was. And when you bought one, of course, you could say, okay, well, this one gets this warm, this one doesn't get that warm. But for most work, you're going to need around 500 degrees. I found it to be, the lower 400 or the upper 400s. At least that's what it is on my soldering station. Seems to be the best for me.
And I mean, one of my most widely used tools back in the day when I was doing a lot of this kind of work, and I picked it up for the first time a couple of weeks ago and discovered that I'm going to have to clean one of the fuel lines. But I have a Weller Pyro pen, the butane loaded cordless soldering iron. And when those first came out, they were just amazing, because you can set the temperature to within, you're basically controlling the flame height. But the other good thing about them was they had a blowtorch tip attachment, so you could turn it into almost like a super concentrated heat gun that would melt the ice out of a snowmobile air intake, for example. May or may not, but anyway, yeah, now, so mine needs a run with a very, very small wire file to clean out some, because it's got some crud in the fuel line somewhere. John mentions he's got one of those too. So yeah, and again, it's just butane loaded soldering iron with, it came with pencil tip and chisel tip, as well as the blowtorch attachment. So different tools for the job. You could turn it down low enough to do circuit board work with it. The big challenge you had to be careful of, the heat exhaust was vented off to the side of the tip. And if you had it rotated the wrong way, you could melt all the wiring that you were trying to solder.
We would have half a beard left, maybe, or
either or, yeah. Oh, there, Mark's mentioned that a torch tip cleaner is a great tool to have, so I may have to pick one of those. And yeah, the heat exhaust was excellent for doing heat shrink tubing.
Pipe cleaners also work for those torch tips too, if you're in a pinch. I don't know who
for a bigger one. Yeah, this is tiny, so yeah. But good point. So here's the big deal. Anybody who's done, and this you're looking at a horizontal view of a circuit board with a through hole plating and a wire going into it, or a component lead, whatever it may be, and then the soldering iron tip. And the big rule of thumb that they beat into our heads in the labs in college was heat the work, not the heat the work, not the solder. So you want to talk to that a little bit, Burley, and
Yeah,
we'll just go
absolutely.
through these ones.
If you're and you have to tin first too, of course. You have to tin the tip of your soldering iron or your device, whatever you're using, gun. But yeah, so tin up the and you'll see. I think we've got a video in here of the actual process. But yeah, it is in the slides actually cycle through. So once your tip is away from the work and you touch your solder onto that, you're tinning it up, and you bring down the iron to the work, and just like the illustrations are showing there, you separately bring down the solder and touch it to the joint, and you always look for those nice fillets there on the side where it kind of gets a little concave. You don't want it bubbling out, that'd be too much solder, and then move them both away at the same time. Sounds easy, doesn't it?
Well, it's like everything else. Practice makes perfect, and here's a prime example of somebody needing more practice. So, like I say, we've over the years we get a pile of stuff in for repair, and you can almost always, not 100% of the time, but almost always tell when somebody's done some work on a board.
Yep.
If you get one in that I know they've worked on and I can't tell, then they'll usually get, well, then I mean, again, I don't get to inspect this stuff on a daily basis anymore, but back in the day, that would be good for a little kudos email or phone call to say, hey, nice work. But so,
Maybe ask
and I
for a
mean,
resume, right?
well, it's one of those things. Now, one of the things you run into a lot, and we don't see an example here, but sometimes you'll see it with wave soldering, is that you don't get nearly enough solder on some connections, where it might be flowed perfectly, but it'll be concave where the solder meets the conductor in the middle of the hole. So that's just something to pay attention to as well, because those ones under any mechanical stress will tend to crack, and then they become open circuits, not short circuits.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I think that if you take anything away from the slideshow on soldering, I think that this slide is probably the most important and illustrative. And just find examples of what not to do. Make it look like this, not like this. And my view on this is, you see the two joints that have OK. I
hmm
think the OK on the right is a hair. In my taste, it would be a tad too much solder.
yeah,
Now, granted, I'm being picky here. And the one on the left, maybe this is the OK on the left. Maybe just quite not enough. I would be
right,
somewhere in between, but I would,
yeah,
if I had to pick one, I would pick the one with the less solder to be
yeah.
OK.
Right, and I mean that's the big challenge, and I mean when you got too much, like the one on the right, or there are a couple of too much ones. The challenge there is twofold. Number one, you can get air bubbles underneath that totally insulate the device being connected, or the lead being connected, to the point that you don't even know if you've got a connection on that one.
Right. If
So
this is,
yeah,
and I think you had alluded to this earlier about through hole soldering. If, say, the third from the right, or any of those that have too much solder on them, if this is a through hole board, then you probably haven't heated that joint long enough for it to kind of suck that solder back into the underside, to the other side of the circuit board. Or
right.
if you have, and you put that solder on there with that big of a bead, you've put way too much solder on.
hmm And that just flicking back here, so this comes back to the heat the work before you start heating or adding solder to it. So you give it that second or two, and then apply the solder and start painting, and away you go. So yeah, and like with everything else. Oh, by the way, I meant to put a picture in for it and forgot, so I'll take the blame for that. If you go to Heathkit or Google Heathkit and solder training, Heathkit actually still exists, surprisingly to me anyway. And they do have solder training kits where you get like a circuit board and a handful of components and a little bit of solder and a soldering iron. and instructions on how to do it. So it's if it's not something you're familiar with or that you've done a lot of, and looking through the audience list, I know a lot of folks in here, like I said, could train me how to solder a lot better than I do already. Um, but for the folks that don't do a lot of soldering, not a bad idea to get something like that where you can do a little bit of practice.
Yep. And they sell ones for surface mount stuff too,
Yes.
which is very handy. You can go on eBay and find those just in bulk. And basically, they send you some random surface mount chips
Hmm.
that will solder up to a generic board, and you can practice there. You can practice, get an old PC that you're about ready to take to recycling. Hopefully, you recycle your electronics. I hope. Get that, and there's tons of modern surface mount devices on an old PC motherboard that you can practice desoldering and resoldering if you like.
Right. And that's one of the things that Dustin had mentioned too. So as an example with those, and a million years ago in another career, actually before Nautel, about so it'd be 35, 40 years ago, I worked at a Radio Shack service depot as a bench repair tech. And we used to get in calculators. Well, the only things that ever fail on calculators, only two things. There's one IC and there's a battery. And if it's not the battery, it's the IC. So, the ICs back then were pretty cheap, and we were on, they had flat rate labor for stuff. So somebody decided, and 40 years ago, calculator was not a nickel 95 like it is now. I mean, now you can get a full blown scientific calculator for under 10 bucks. Well, shoot, every cell phone's got one built in.
Yeah.
But back then, I mean, my Sharp 5103, I think I paid 150 bucks for that back in the early 80s, give or take. So, you know, it wasn't uncommon for somebody to drop 50 bucks on repairing a calculator. And we didn't have surface mount solder stations at the radio. I had a paste solder station, pencil iron and a solder sucker. And a solder sucker will not do a good job on a surface mount device, not to the point where you can lift a 64 pin flat pack IC off. So my trick for that one, I just take an X-Acto knife, run it down the edges of the IC and cut all the leads off, and then remove the leads one or two at a time with the solder sucker or with braid. And Dustin had made a comment in the advanced questions about how to use braid effectively. And that's a challenge. Two reasons. And this comes back to the solderability thing about soldering. When you're using solder braid, you are effectively running through the same process. And solder braid oxidizes easily. And once it's oxidized, you don't get the heat transfer. So at that point, you don't end up getting the wicking action that you need to remove solder. So that's one. The second thing that I run into a lot is because solder braid has a much bigger surface area, it requires more heat. You're not going to remove solder with braid and a 20-watt pencil tip iron. For that, you should have a 70-watt chisel tip to get better heat transfer. Remembering the other caveat, don't overheat the work and lift the track off the board. So that's, I think, my big things about solder braid is it does take a little more heat, and you do need to have clean braid. So you know how like solder braid comes in that plastic sleeve, and I've seen a lot of people, yeah, and a lot of people will fold the backside of the sleeve and just leave it dangling so it's easier to pull loose. The downside to that is that you're leaving it open for oxidation. So leave it in the sleeve as long as you can.
And also for those who may be new, this is a solder sucker.
Uh-huh.
And basically you push it like that, you heat up your solder, you put it on the joint, and
it's a little vacuum.
Solder up. So it's got a little nozzle on there, and you can take these apart and clean them, dump your solder out, but look on Amazon, you can find those. And the solder braid, I really don't use solder braid much anymore outside of maybe surface mount stuff. Actually, since you and I did this session, I was going to tell you, Jeff, I tried your technique of cutting the leads first. That works like a dream. That worked great.
So
and then you go in, and then you can either solder suck the old leads off. They actually come up inside the solder sucker, so you have to clean it out, or use your braid to.
Yeah, and I see a couple of comments coming in. Chuck mentions he needs an SBE certification level for soldering, such as CSS for certified solder specialist.
I don't know if he's kidding, but I think that's great. I would do
Yeah.
it.
And Jeff mentions that definitely additional heating required to get the wigging action in braid can be an issue, and what that does to the board you're soldering or whatever you're desoldering, I guess.
In,
And Rick mentioned storing the solder braid in a Ziploc bag between uses, which is another good idea.
and Jeff, hopefully you still have me. I just lost my monitor. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, you're here, and the camera's here.
Okay. But yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say. My monitor going out just kind of threw me off. You carry on. I'm going to troubleshoot that real quick.
Okay, so let's see. Ron mentions bat winging RF transistors if you know where they're bat. And so here's something that as engineering folks, we tend to be some worse than others. But I've walked into so many sites where there will be a box of components labeled maybe bad. And bad is not a sliding scale. It's a pretty binary decision. It's bad or it's not bad. There's not a lot of in between there. So you got the picture back now?
I'm back.
Was it plugged in?
I don't know what happened. It's one of those. It'll happen again, I'm sure.
Oh, of course. Yeah, if you don't know what happened, it'll definitely happen again. So,
Absolutely.
my general rule of thumb is if I pull something out and I'm going through the shotgunning process, everything that comes out goes in the garbage. I don't even begin to pretend, oh, it might be good. Yeah, no, there is no might be good. There's good and there's not good.
Yeah, I agree. In
And
the
don't
general
know
sense,
is not good.
I was just going to say, in the general sense, most of the time parts are fairly cheap depending on what they are. So yeah, you probably have a stock of them anyway. So
Yeah. So there you go. So Dustin, okay. So do you lay? Yes. All right. So how to use the braid? So getting back to the braid, what you would do, you would lay the braid on the joint to where you want the solder removed, and then you would lay your chisel tip iron on top of the braid. And as the iron heats the braid, then the braid will heat the work and wick the solder away. That's the description on it. Let's see. And where to buy the braid locally. Uh, so that one is $1 billion question. Used to be Radio Shack was the answer. I think
yeah,
Amazon would be my answer now. I don't know locally.
I think, and I sent you a link to this a while back, Jeff, that you can actually get decent. I don't know about down to solder braid, but you can get that at Harbor Freight. We have that in Ohio. I think that's kind of an Eastern U.S. thing.
Yep.
Not sure where all that is, but solder pencil, solder
Mm-hmm.
braid. Basically, you're tinning up. You still have to tin up your solder tip, right? So
Yeah.
go down to the joint, heat it up, and then you can either drag it across depending on what kind of solder joint it is, or lay the braid on top of the joint, heat up the area on the solder braid that is right above the joint. And then what I do is just tend to drag it off. And I'm kind of exaggerating here because my camera is not zoomed in, but you drag off the solder braid, and you'll probably have some cleanup to do. That's why I don't like solder braid that much. I'm not that good with it.
Yeah.
If possible, you use the solder sucker, same technique. Tin up your solder tip with your soldering iron tip, and then say that let's say that the solder braid is your solder joint, right? So you go down, heat it up, and very quickly you put your solder sucker. It kind of has a disposable tip on it. You can change those tips out, so it's going to kind of melt every now and then. They tend to melt at a higher temperature, and then do that, sucks the solder right off. These larger ones tend to work a lot better than the smaller ones, but this is
Yeah.
kind of a standard size. So you
Mm-hmm.
can find those on Amazon.
Yeah, and very much that'll come back to what you're comfortable with and familiar with. I mean, the thing I found about the suckers is if you don't clean them on a very regular basis, a lot of times you're going to end up throwing solder flakes back out as it kicks back.
Yep.
And so as somebody who is probably not as good at cleaning things as he should be, or not as what's the word? Um, Not as rigorous about it, the braid is the answer for me.
Yeah.
Let's see, Jason mentions snip a 1-inch piece of braid, apply flux to braid. Oh, there's a good idea. Flux for heat transfer. I think, yeah, Jerry had mentioned that too. Put on top of area to wick, apply soldering iron. If kept attached to the roll will act like a heat sink. So that's a good point. If you cut a piece of braid off, you'll get better heat transfer too.
Yeah. So, and I've seen people do that, and they use a hemostat, a pair of hemostats. Like you can get those at military surplus seems to have. They seem to have hemostats. A lot of times where they sell soldering supplies, Amazon, you can get those. But you clip that onto your braid, like Jeremy, I think it was saying. After you clip off, just get your wire cutters out, clip off the braid, clip, and you clip because you're not going to be able to hang on to that. You're not going to be able to hang on to that. Believe it or not, this little strip will heat up very quickly.
Yeah. And yeah, Jensen Tools used to sell hemostats. Klein does. I'm fairly certain that Ideal Tools do. Here's something for those of us that use a lot of like little picks and hemostats. Dentist's office. Ask them for old scrap ones. They're no longer good stick in people's mouths, but they work great for a circuit board.
You've mentioned that before, and that still kind of grosses me out.
Hey. My theory is you run it through the dishwasher, it's pretty clean after, but again, I'm not sticking it in my mouth.
That's right.
Let's see. Mark mentions the desoldering tools as well. And yeah, Jason, there's a good point. Jason brought up Canadian Tire, but fishing stores, fishing supply stores. If you get anybody that makes their own fishing flies, they almost always use something like that. Radio Shack used to have the coolest thing called I think it was called No More Hands or something like that. But it was a little metal bracket with a couple of adjustable brackets with a whole bunch of alligator clips that you could use for holding work as you were soldering and desoldering. And I've still got one around, but maybe missing one of the alligator clips. I don't know why.
But for me, I've always, and here's for those, and I know we have tons of experienced guys out there, like you said, Jeff, that know more than you and I know probably put together on soldering, but here's a pair of hemostats. And if you look, they lock together like that, and you pull them apart. So then you squeeze them together and separate them like that. And then what you can do, and this has worked for me for years. Basically, you grab, and this is a little 3/8 inch connector, not a good example, but you can hold it that way and lay it down, and that helps you to solder. Basically, you have to be careful because your countertop has to be kind of high heat proof, or carry around a small piece of aluminum with you if you can. Put it in your toolkit, put it underneath that, and then basically you have some helping hands to help you solder.
Yeah. Oh, and Mark mentioned you can get the little helping hands, the alligator clips things I was talking about at Harbor Freight as well. So we are at slightly after the top of the hour, and I know a few folks had to drop off. I hope they'll catch the recording, and let's get moving. This is one of those, when we did the session in Columbus, we had 45 minutes to an hour, and we knew we were going to run long. Yeah. But yeah, it's a given that that'll happen. So the one thing I'm going to comment while we show the video of you soldering the XLR is just your little XLR holding jig it just really struck me as cool.
All I did was a friend of mine, Mogan David. Some of you may know him from iHeart. He used to work at Federated Media in Fort Wayne, but he had shown me this really cool block that you can buy. And I can't remember what it's called, but you can get them with different configurations. But there's an AV block that has all these different little holes in it to hold different types of connectors. I thought, that's great. I got to get one of those. Well, it was like $70, $70. And I thought, well, heck, I've got a piece of scrap wood. And so really all I did was take an XLR connector and mark the holes and a couple drill bits here and there. And I've got a little piece of wood in the shop that I keep for that. But by the way, if you ever want to learn how good of a soldering tech you are or how bad, do this. Get a cell phone out and zoom in on your soldering job as you're doing it. And I tell you what, if you're like me and you're slightly critical of yourself, yeah, so it looks a lot better further away.
So first really dumb question. Is the sleeve further up the wire or laying on the bench beside you? Because that's my big thing. You put an XLR on, it's like, oh shoot, there's the sleeve.
I always say I do my best solder work with the sleeve not on the cable. Yeah. If it's the last cable, the last connector on the cable. Yep, yeah. I guarantee you.
Now, John Antonuk made a good comment too when we were talking about hemostats that in a pinch, you can wrap a rubber band around the handles of a pair of needle nose pliers
Yep.
to make yourself a quick clamp.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
pull hard on the mic cable to test the solder joints. So, yep, exactly. Oh, and Dustin's got to run out because microwave point enter power over Ethernet probably just dropped.
Uh-oh.
So it wouldn't be broadcast if somebody didn't have to leave because something went sideways at some point. So that kind of covers the thing on soldering. The let's see, odds of leaving the back shell off increases exponentially with the number of pins on the connector.
Boy, yeah,
No
isn't
doubt
that the
about
truth?
that, John.
I
Um,
wonder if that's why they make the D sub connector as a shell that you don't have to put on ahead of time.
yeah. So toolkit wise, we had talked about this and we'll just whip through this. This, as you say here, very much will vary from one person to another and what they're doing. I mean, this is just what you'll find in my laptop case. I mean, this is the laptop case that goes with me everywhere. And that FLIR IR camera is still by far my favorite toy. I
Yep.
mean, the Max Connect Wi-Fi router is really useful if you end up in a place where you can't get a internet connection. A couple of flashlights and a spare battery pack from Skyline Tower Painters. Most of my stuff is promo stuff, whether from Nautel or from other companies. You see my digigram, that digigram with that #1 Phillips bit will tear apart a VX transmitter, take everything out of it except for the four, I think they're 10mm nuts that hold the Meanwell low voltage power supply in. Everything else is #1 Phillips, and those little promotional screwdrivers work great. So
Gotta love that.
that's,
As an
yeah.
example, I've got my Seek Thermal here live. I don't know if anybody's ever seen these, but very handy. And all it is, this is just an iPad. As a matter of fact, it's a really old iPad,
Mm-hmm.
and the little Seek Thermal device on there. And you can get them for Android, you can get them for iPhone, iPad.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who uses an iPad anymore besides me, but it works really well. I think you can see me on here, as a matter of
Yep.
fact. But yeah, very handy for, like Jeff was saying. I think, as a matter of fact, you're the one that told me about these years ago when I was
Mm-hmm.
watching the seminar with you. But going through breaker panels and such, and I found several different electrical items that needed replaced just because they're heating up and getting old.
Right. And I mean, whether it's the FLIR, which is what I use, or the Peak, or any of the others, I mean, having some sort of thermal camera. Now, don't assume that you're going to get an exact temperature reading. Unless you've done some training on thermography, and we did do a session on thermographics with Gary Cavell, back late 2023, I think it was. So you can find it in our archives. But absolutely, as a relative reading, if you stand in the same place and take the picture at the same point every time, you're going to say, oh, this is quite a bit hotter than it was last time. And it can be the difference between a site fire and not having a site fire.
Yep.
Now, this is what goes in my laptop every time I walk out the door, and of course the mandatory first aid kits and sinus medication. But this is just what I'm going to have anytime I run into anybody. At home, I've got a slightly different set of tools. #1, metric and imperial, depending, because you never know what you're working on for wrenches. Um, and I told Burley in our pregame, that thing in the lower left is a game changer. I mean, every toolkit you run into, somebody's got a crescent wrench for that day when you don't have just the right open end or combo wrench. But that thing in the lower left will take your crescent wrench game to a whole new level. I mean, and it's a vice grip crescent wrench. And I saw it on Facebook once and thought it was a joke, and then got poking around and found these ones, and they're Crescent brand. But I found that one on Amazon, and it allows you to lock. So you set your crescent wrench to where you want it, and then you can lock it in place with the vice grip handle. And it removes the risk of bruised and skinned knuckles. So it's huge. Top left corner on my toolkit is a borescope, a video borescope. And that one was under $100 on Amazon. It's got a 50-foot cable. Uh, I've got it primarily for snaking my drain here at the house, the French drain in the basement. But if you've got to look for a piece of hardware in a transmitter, it's got a couple of tip attachments that go on over the camera. One of them is magnetic for picking up hardware, and one of them's got a little set of graspers for the stainless steel hardware that you're not getting with the magnet. So just a handy little tool. Again, $100, you can, if you've got to look in a power supply, you dropped a screw and you want to be sure it's on the floor and not across the AC terminals or something, then it's a handy tool if you don't have the time to tear everything apart. Good idea for, I've used it before to look in transmitters to see if that smell is coming from a mouse across the rectifier stack, as an example. So uh, Jeff Detweiler says it's good for using inspecting line bullets, and again, same deal, because it's somewhat flexible but fairly rigid, and you can go up. Yeah, you could run it up and take a look, or the Teflon, the spiral wrap on a line. So that's a handy tool. I carry, of course, as I'm getting older, I'm discovering that there are more prescriptions than there ever used to be. But I like the pill bottles just because they give me different, they're stackable for one, so less space in the toolkit. And they, you know, something to hold the rack screws or all the chassis screws as I take them out. So I'm not leaving them on a panel sitting to the side that I'm about to step on and launch all over the building. And then to the right of that, I mean, I've got to the left my little bag of screwdrivers, and you see one crescent wrench sitting in there. That's probably going to move back to my woodworking toolkit. But a solder, or sorry, a grabbing a screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver with a grabber on it, so that it'll actually hold on to the screw, especially if you've got one that's a little further back and hard to get to in a chassis. I can think of a few situations where that'd be useful. And then the usual flashlights, extension cords, Cat 5 cable, and a handful of assortment Phillips bits, because those like to strip on a regular basis. So that's my go-to toolkit. Burley, I know yours is behind you, and on the on your, you just basically said, okay, it's still evolving. So
Yeah,
run us
mine
through
is just
yours real quick.
okay. Yeah, mine is gotta have the fluke. Basically, gotta have the fluke. Take the fluke multimeter everywhere I go. And this guy is. I didn't have it in my car this morning because I was hauling one of the grandkids the other day. I had to run back home and grab it. You know, how's that for being prepared, right? But
Hmm.
nice fluke. I prefer fluke. I trust them. I know some guys that use even the Harbor Freight type knockoff ones, but you know, this is people pay me to do this for a living, so I prefer to spend some money on at least something like that, because you know,
Yeah.
that's it's very important. A couple of the things that I wouldn't ever do without, especially working on transmitters, is a stubby screwdriver, and this
Yeah.
is a one made by Klein. It's really a little it's a multi screwdriver, which I'm not really
Mm.
big into the multi screwdrivers, as you can tell. I like a real screwdriver typically, but I didn't want to carry a bunch of stubby screwdrivers around. And this guy works great to get into little areas.
Yeah.
You know, when they design things, they can't, transmitters included. I'm sure Nautel has this issue as well, where you can't design every screw that is easily accessible all the time. So you're not always disassembling everything in the order that the factory wanted you to. So this is very handy. Uh, and of
I'll
course,
add to that. If you've got an offset screwdriver, you can get offset ratcheting screwdrivers now, where like that little box of bits I had just pops into a 90-degree handle.
yep. Yeah, that's one of my must-haves is a 90-degree screwdriver, because there's places where that stubby won't even get into. That you know, you need that and the flashlight. That's one of my other things. Got to have a
Mhm.
flashlight. Always carry good batteries in them. I like to use rechargeable batteries a lot of times, but
Yep.
I always use, and don't buy the cheap ones. Buy the Energizer, Duracell. Those are the ones that survive, because this thing sits in the cold in my truck. Right now, I think it's like 5 degrees outside here in Ohio.
Yeah.
This thing has to be ready. Another fine example is I got this. This is a Milwaukee pen light made by Milwaukee, who makes the tools, power
Hmm.
tools. Started carrying this in my truck when I needed it. That little rubber button when it got cold outside, you couldn't really press it. Now it works
Right.
great. Works great. This guy, I don't even know what brand. It's a Cat brand, which I think is some generic. It's Caterpillar, right? The equipment manufacturer. But I think I got this at like Lowe's home improvement store, and it was like $6 or $7. The little rubber on that works great. It stays in this thing all the time.
Yep.
This is not for painting. This is for dusting. OCD at all, you go through the transmitter, maybe you got the vacuum that's there at, should have a shop vac at all your transmitter sites, right? Go through and brush, and while you're sucking up all the dust and everything that always comes through. My Ohio Association of Broadcasters tape measure. This was a great little device they gave us a couple years ago at the engineering conference, which has little increments on it for rack spaces. You can see,
Cool.
so you can measure the racks and go, oh yeah, I need a 5-space blank panel to fill that hole if you care about that kind of thing. One thing as I get older, the old wrists and hands aren't as powerful as they used to be, and they don't stand up to, I'm mid 50s, they don't do a lot of repetition. If you're taking out a bunch of rack panels, this little guy right here, it's just a little screwdriver, electric screwdriver. You can take the bits out, change them around. If we get far enough and we go through the other kits that are on the slide reel, you're going to see that some of the people we have pictures of their kits, they have devices like this. This is a Milwaukee driver. Doesn't have to be Milwaukee. Go to Harbor Freight, someplace like that, discount tools. I know a guy who has a drill that he got at Harbor Freight, I think for $20. Works great. It helped us out in a pinch just a couple of weeks ago. I didn't have this with me, and he had his $20 Harbor Freight rechargeable drill. And you either use these to get a bit and use it as you would the screwdriver, or you can get the drill version, use it as a drill. Lots of options there. Let's see, screwdrivers. Another thing I wouldn't do without a good pair of flush cutting wire cutters, knives, whatever you want to call them. And then down to the meat and potatoes underneath here. Take this pallet out real quick. Small Jensen socket set. I don't think they even sell this anymore, but it's a little SAE socket set. Haven't used it in a while. Larger wrenches on a nice carabiner.
There, see, you're going to have to get you one of those vice grip ones now.
These little guys are very handy for cleaning, detail cleaning. The long Q-tips, I guess you'd call them. Don't use these in your ear. And let's see here. Just, a little. I love the fishing tackle boxes like these. You can put little doodads in there. I've got a couple, I think, AA batteries. Got a Bic lighter in there. Some ICs, which you don't run across too much anymore. For when was the last time I had to replace an IC on an emergency trip? It's been a while. But this is what Jeff was talking about, the little right angle ratcheting screwdriver. And this was just a cheapie I got someplace. Comes with some sockets, a bunch of little bits you can put in there. Let's see here, what else? Oh, wire nuts for electrical. Ziploc bags really help kind of organize everything. Just some miscellaneous wire, electrical tape. Gotta have electrical tape. Buy the good stuff. Don't buy the cheap stuff. Buy the 3M. Of course, patch cable. Can't have enough patch cables. What's the proper name of this? This is a good trivia question. Proper name of this cable right here is an IEC power cable. I call them computer power cable, detachable power cable. Never know you're going to need one and not have it. Ball peen hammer, or as I like to call it, disc jockey alignment tool.
Just call it an attitude adjuster.
Attitude adjuster. And of course, my soldering iron, which I kind of tore out of there just a little bit ago. I put it in this Shure mic case. This is one of the, you buy a Shure SM58, you get one of these little zip cases. And I put I've had this soldering iron since, probably for about 35 years. I love these things. This is a little Unger that they don't sell anymore. So I put that in that case. And I never used to carry one of these. I used to just kind of like a smoker puts their cigarette on the side of a desk. I would do that with my soldering iron, but I've since opted for a little cheapy. I think I got this at a Hamfest. Just a little $5 or $6 used soldering stand. And in case you didn't know, soldering iron goes in there. And since I don't carry water with me, I use the little Brillo pad tip cleaner, which is nice. I don't think they work as well as a wet foam sponge, but basically before you tin up your tip and your soldering iron, you just kind of drag it across there, and then you hit it with your solder, and then it's tinned up. Another thing which I think is huge, which I really need to replenish this, it's a little Altoid box with hardware, miscellaneous hardware, which I'm not sure if you've all done this or not, but all those Star Guide satellite receivers you have laying around, great source of small stainless steel hardware. So before you send them off to recycle, take all the hardware out of them. Great source. And then the other thing that comes in very, very handy is this is just an ideal brand cable cutter. And it's also got the, you look, if I could get my hands to work, if you could look in here, it's got a little crimp area to crimp the, what they call it, I call them automotive lugs, but really they're spade lugs, etc. We have those all over the place in our facility, and they are these guys. And I always carry a couple spade lugs with me, just a handful of them. If you look right in here, you can kind of see them, but they crimp these onto wires and whatnot, but very handy. So I think that's about it. Miscellaneous wrenches. One of the things that I was taught by my good friend Jack Didier back when I was a newbie, he was kind of my mentor when I was growing up in the industry. You gotta have Sharpies. Gotta have Sharpies. Temporarily marking wires. If you pull a cable, piece of 8723 or something that's gray, you can mark on there, oh yeah, this goes to the studio mic 1, something like that, until you label it correctly. Ideally, I'd like to have the fine point Sharpies, which I think I have one. Now that I have this in my office, I'll put this in my toolkit. This is probably the go-to point Sharpie. Very handy. And they seem to last in cold weather. They don't have any issues. I've made a complete mess of my desk. But one last thing, and this is very handy. Got this little tool roll from, I think it was Sears back in the day when they actually were a decent tool store, right? When they existed. And really, it's just unroll it, and I've got miscellaneous, and these are kind of cheap wrenches just some wrenches, different sizes, metric, whatnot. But if you have that one that Jeff has, the little adjustable guy, you don't need all that.
I still carry them. It never hurts. And I mean, we've had some other things come in the comments while you're looking for the next thing. William always mentions having spare batteries, 9-volt AA, AAA, and the 2032 was a big one, the coin cells.
Yep, absolutely.
We use those for controllers.
Got to have I call these diddle sticks. I don't know, calibration tools. Used to come with an Optimod back in the day.
Yeah, tweaker is my highly technical term, but yeah.
Tweaker.
And Ed, if you're hanging around, Jeff Detweiler put in a link in the questions for handy clamp, a good tool for reaching places your hand can't reach, which as I get older and clumsier seems like more places than ever. Chuck mentions that it's a good idea to have a crossover cable because there's some stuff that doesn't auto detect. So, and as we do more IT stuff, that's huge.
You know what I've been,
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What I was going to say is I used to carry a crossover cable, and I don't anymore. I haven't needed them in a while. But one thing, and let me get up and I'll show you this. Everybody's seen one of these. And one thing that's handy, of course, this requires you to carry 2 patch cables instead of 1 crossover cable, but this has its uses too. Just a tiny little network switch. And this guy's pretty small. You can throw him in here pretty easy. Easy to carry. You got another power supply, of course, but we use these sometimes on remotes at our radio stations, but just an option.
And I mean, I'm always got a handful of USB hubs and things like that as well. It's worth, depending on what you do, like here, I've got a 7-port powered USB hub because it turns out I have a whole lot more things connected than I have computer to power them. Let's see here. John remembers the 10100 crossover cable will not work for gigabit crossover cable uses. or gigabit uses all 8 wires. So make sure you've got the right cable for the job too. Good point.
Okay.
Now we're going to have to whip through the last, but you did show some other ones. So you've got Mogan's and cable tester was one thing that he had in there that I forgot to mention in my list.
Yep. Yeah, cable tester. I've had some people say, as a matter of fact, when I came to work here, the IT guys that we had at the time, I said, "Do you guys have a cable tester for Cat5 cables?" They said, "No, we plug them in and they work, they work."
Yeah.
I
And
like a cable tester.
one of the other things he had though that really, and I've got one here because I do a lot of woodworking, and I never thought about it for a field case, but a kneeling pad, like the little foam, is that yellow foam pad there, just give you something that so you're not beating the daylights out of your knees all day.
Yep, and don't buy those in the tool section. Go to the garden section and get them where they're a
Hmm.
lot cheaper.
Yep. And then Jim's is a little more, a little lighter weight, but again, you know, I saw as I started looking through a lot of commonality.
Yeah.
Like I see the paintbrush for the cleaning, and then of course the screwdrivers and all the standard stuff we use.
Yep. And you know, when I first started, and I think I told this story real quick, Bill Rossini, retired engineer from iHeart Toledo, Ohio. A lot of you probably know Bill. He's pretty well known. He had told me he had taken me under his wing as a contract engineer when I was going to college, and I showed up with a case similar to this. Just some random tools, probably my dad gave me back in the day, and
Hmm.
we showed up at a transmitter site, and he was helping me work on an old tube transmitter. And he said, "Burley," he says, "I'm going to show you something." He said, "Here's what I carry with me." He says, and I think it was basically the stubby, the wire cutters, and a small multimeter. But
Hmm.
you know, Bill was also packing with him a whole bunch of wisdom and skill that he learned over the years too. So
Yep, yep. And,
I was
and
trying to
Marco makes
compensate with tools.
Marco makes a good comment in the questions too, that he made a double cat 5 cat jack that'll do crossover. So yeah,
Uh,
that's certainly, you can always wire a custom, just a little jack box to give you a crossover. Remember back in the day, it used to be the DB9 connectors we used to wire for a null modem adapter, and
mhm.
I just dated myself there. And then, yep. So you see a lot of commonality in there. I see Josh has got a soldering iron and a pair of headphones, which is
And
useful.
notice the umbrella too.
Hmm. And that's something, like I said, I didn't mention it so much, but like in my laptop bag, I carry t-shirt, underwear, change of socks, both for when United loses my suitcase, and for those times when you happen to be out at a site and get sideways to something little wet, step in a hole or a puddle or whatever. So it never hurts to have that. Here you see a couple of the extra screwdrivers with Jack's kit, the handheld screwdrivers. And looking lower right, I see some burnishing tools and looks like a couple of reamers. So,
Yeah, he's got and just like I said, Jack and Mogan's kits were probably what inspired me to carry that little Milwaukee driver, which I find very handy. I have one at home too, so I have one for my kit now. But
yeah.
yeah, a lot of different bits. Oh, the alligator clips. I call them clip leads, where you have an
Mhm.
alligator clip on one end of the wire, alligator clip on the other. Very
Right.
handy. I've got those somewhere in here.
Yeah. And
Very handy.
so John just mentioned that he liked the idea of the two jack crossover gizmos. So Marco, thumbs up for that. And that kind of is the whole point of these sessions, is see if anybody can get an idea for something that's like, oh, I think I need one of those. So
Yep.
and then we're back into Jack's toolkit, just an exploded view. So that is the high points in a nutshell. We ran half an hour late. This may be tied for one of our longest sessions ever. Um, but hey, it was a fun time.
You know,
So shout
I
out
was gonna
to
say.
HO USA. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say you get us talking about most guys talking about tools, and we could go. I could go on forever. I know that. But yeah, thanks to Heiko Tools.
Yeah, and mandatory resources, and I don't know if my status bar is showing up at the bottom. If it is, I apologize for that, but somebody sent me an email. Anyway, um, so this webinar, as with all Nautel webinars, will be archived. You will be able to find it through the resources tab of our website. Waves newsletter, I know Fiona was working on one. I don't know if it's out yet. I haven't seen the email, but I've been busy, so I haven't paid enough attention. If there isn't one out right away, or there will be one very soon. YouTube channel, we put a bunch of stuff there, including customer service shortcuts, how-tos for common questions, and then all the mandatory onlines like Barry Michigan's BDR.net. I know I see a few people in the audience that I've seen at those on before. So on that note, Burley, I want to thank you very much for giving up a couple hours of your day to hang with us, and for providing all the cool ideas.
Any
And
excuse I can get to talk tools and find new tool ideas I can bother my wife with to tell her I need such and such new tools. Hey, I'm here. Thanks for having me, Jeff, really.
so, like I said, crescent wrench vice grips, you Google that on Amazon, and I promise you, the first time you use it, you'll go, "Where has this been all my life?"
You
So,
need an infomercial.
well, so the day I was at a site in Alberta, which is where most of my good stories happen in Canada, but the day I was at a site and I was pulling a set of 293 cast mica capacitors out of an RF output filter. And for whatever reason, I'd taken the minimalist toolkit, so I had a crescent wrench instead of a full set of wrenches, and slipped, and I banged my hand against a piece of a folded angle bracket of 3/8" aluminum. And you need a lot of torque to pull those bolts out of a 293 cast mica cap. So I had a lot of torque going on, and it hit hard, and there was a string of colorful language. So, yep. And John mentions, if you run contracting business on the side, all of your tool purchases are tax deductible. And absolutely make sure that you've got, and this is from the University of Arkansas, but make sure you've got a portable first aid kit in your toolkit. Whether it's, and as a minimum, I carry, and like I said, most of my stuff is promo. There's a tube of hand sanitizer. It was a big thing in the COVID days, but it comes in handy as a just quick cleanup thing for the toolkit. So absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks all you folks for coming back. And I know it's been a long while, and I apologize for the delay. We do have another one coming up in about 3 weeks. And of course, Mr. Disembodied Voice will tell me what it's about. But yeah, it's kind of cool to be back in the saddle again. So on that note, we'll let you all go, and we'll talk to you all later. Thank you very much. Have a good day now. Bye.